Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us so early on a Friday after quite an intense week. Many of you, or some of you, may have come last night to the showing of the UN Whistleblowers film. And so that really sort of set some of the scene, but we won't stop there, obviously. My name is Anna Myers. I'm the Executive Director of the Whistleblowing International Network. I'm originally Canadian and a lawyer, but I now live in Scotland and for many years worked in London at an NGO that advised whistleblowers, now called Protect, that was called Public Concern at Work. So over the years, I have met a number of people through anti-corruption work and in running WIN, which is a network of the organizations that support whistleblowers around the world because they needed very much to share their hard-won expertise at national level across borders, learn from each other, and certainly over the last 10 years, we are seeing more cross-border whistleblowing. Partly that's how business and power works across borders, so you will get whistleblowers raising issues in industries, and they raise them in ways that the industries are operating as well. So I have an amazing panel to moderate a discussion for you this morning and with you this morning. And I think we'll do it very much beginning with some questions for each of the panelists. We have also someone who's sitting in the audience who's also going to be able to speak a bit from the staff representation union side, along with Mark Polane, who's also on the podium with us. So I would like to start very much by setting the scene. Over the years, UN whistleblowers have been raising issues, and some have come to the attention of the organizations. There's not really many organizations that will help litigate with whistleblowers in the UN system. The UN system is quite unique. And Government Accountability Project, which is also up here, is one of the few nonprofit with dedicated whistleblower organizations that have worked directly to help represent whistleblowers through the UN system. But the whistleblowing protection community has been aware of these cases, and amongst the WIN protection community, we've supported some of the whistleblowers that were in the film last night. And this really is, I hope you'll think about whistleblowing as also not just a personal journey. These are people, professionals who are trying to address problems. And in the end, what whistleblowers really show for us is whether or not our accountability mechanisms are working. So Jim, let's start with you. James Wasserstrom, could you, for those of you who did not manage to make the film, I don't know why, at 8 o'clock last night, could you please give a little bit of your background, your work at the UN, the problems you came across, and what happened when you tried to address them?
Thank you, Anna. I am a 28-year veteran of the UN until I was kicked out at the end, just before retirement. But my experience, I think, is one of an illustrative example. There are many very similar or even worse than my case. I was sent in a UN peacekeeping operation to Kosovo, which was at that point administering the breakaway province. And I was brought there initially to be the head of logistics. But because I had worked in the private sector, the special representative of the Secretary General at the time asked me to look at 2,000 pages of external audit reports on Kosovo's public utilities, which had been lying around unopened for several months because the senior official in charge was afraid of what might be in these reports. So I looked into the documents, and of course I found massive fraud, waste, abuse, corruption, and every imaginable kind of criminal behavior, white-collar crime, and came up with a roadmap of 38 steps that could be taken to clean out these large operations. They were the largest contributor and still are to Kosovo's GDP, and presented that to the SRSG. He then took me to a secret meeting in Vienna with the head of the UN Inspector General and the head of the EU Office for the Fight Against Fraud, Olaf, which was running the part of UNMIC where most of the corruption was nested. So I presented the roadmap. they liked it. We came back to Kosovo, and he called me into his office some days later and said, they like this, and we now need to do something about it. And we'd like to establish an office that is designated to clean these utilities out. And you're going to head it. So I said, well, that's very nice of you, but I already have a job. I have a full-time day job. And he said, well, now you have two. You're going to run them in parallel, two separate operations in two separate locations, which I proceeded to do for the next 4 years. And during that period, we did end up executing, I think, what I call, among other things, the 3 Ds of demotions, dismissals, and detentions. Established new forms of corporate governance. We incorporated them into modern entities and cleaned them out, and removed political interference, and introduced internal controls, and so on. Along the way, in one of the public utilities, the electricity utility known as KEC, there was a bid that was going to be put out for a new coal mine and power plant that was going to be worth a contract value of $5 billion US. And I was informed by a number of sources who were not known to each other of a 10% kickback that would go to Kosovo officials and my UN colleagues who were managing the governor and deputy governor of the province, in other words, the SRSG, but mainly the principal deputy SRSG, retired US Army general named Steve Shook, that he was going to get a piece of the 10% kickback, which was $500 million, and the rest would go to the Kosovo government officials who were in charge of the Ministry of Energy and Mines and so on. So I, after I had accumulated a number of reports on this, I sent this secretly to the UN Inspector General, and she launched an investigation, also secret, with 12 investigators into this allegation, with which I cooperated. Unfortunately, since everything in the UN leaks like a sieve, there's no such thing as real confidentiality. The fact that I was cooperating, she wrote an email to the then Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, and a variety of senior officials, of course, who immediately sent it on to the people who I alleged were involved in the heinous crime that was being undertaken. And they began a series of retaliatory acts against me, one of which involved the almost immediate closure of my office and my return to my home agency, which was UNDP. This was all done summarily. So the utilities, when this came out, the utilities themselves approached me and said, 30 days before I was due to leave, they said, we'd really like you to come back and help us, because we are still being subjected to political interference and a variety of other measures. And I said, sure. So the UN, the SRSG, found out about this and decided to make this into a federal crime, and accused me of breaking laws, rules, and regulations, the Kosovo laws, as well as UN rules and regulations, which were all false. Again, the issue that the UN does over and over and over again, the practice of trumped-up charges against people who threaten the organization, whistleblowers, and the organization's reputation. It's a very common tactic. We see it over and over and over again, and if you were at the film last night, you would have heard this from other whistleblowers. So I live in Greece, and I was going home on my normal weekend to visit my family. And when I arrived at the border, Kosovo and North Macedonia, I was arrested by the UN border police and brought back under armed guard by UN financial police to my residence, where they then conducted an illegal search and seizure of my property and detained me. Of course, I knew the procedures since I was involved in detentions and dismissals, and I knew that since I had immunity, functional immunity, that had to be lifted. That can only be done by the Secretary General. It's a very complicated and cumbersome process. It doesn't happen very often. So everything I was being told was pure lies. I mean, it was obviously lies. But there's nothing I could do about it. They conducted the search. They took a number of items from me. I was held overnight, and then I was eventually allowed to go. But in the meantime, the UN released to the media that I was a corrupt UN official caught while attempting to flee. So that story was picked up in 26 countries, including where I live, and was blasted by the UN over and over and over again for the next 12 months. They placed crime scene tape up across my office door. They barred me from the premises. They took away all of my pass, all of my UN credentials. And they even went so far as to post wanted posters with my face, my contact details on the exit and entrance to every one of the 26 premises of the UN in Kosovo. So anyone would know what I looked like, how to reach me, where I lived, etc. Which is unheard of, actually, in the UN. So, but they went to these really dramatic extremes. The media drumbeat against me got louder and louder. There were threats against my life, and I'm only here today because my deputy, Kosovar, and closest friend, whose family, his large clan, tribe of thousands of people, had their ear to the ground to protect me, and they blocked it from taking place. This was all this was connected to the UN, so that is not beyond the reach. So other people have not been so lucky, by the way. So that was resolved, but in the meantime, the UN launched the criminal investigation because they controlled the law enforcement apparatus. They launched an administrative investigation against me. There was the underlying investigation of corruption. I was suspended during this whole period, and I asked for an investigation of retaliation against me. The process by which I threaded this needle to get that in place was extraordinary, and is still one of very, 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 very few investigations that take place, despite the hundreds of claims of whistleblowers that have come through the ethics office. It's I think a 5% or less rate of individuals whose claims of whistleblowing pass this ridiculous test. So, but I managed to get through that mainly because I knew the people in the ethics office who I trained, and they went along with it, and it was turned over to the UN investigative operation called UNOIOS. So there were 4 investigations simultaneously. That went on for a year, and in the end, I was cleared criminally within weeks. In terms of the administrative charges against me, as well as the retaliation investigation, those were both washed away with a report that said I had exercised bad judgment, but that everything that happened to me was random acts by rogue actors, which is the title of the book I will write if I ever write one, Random Acts by Rogue Actors. I mean, it's completely ridiculous. So I had an attorney. I'm from New York, and I knew of the only attorney who had ever successfully beaten the UN in its own so-called justice system on a charge of egregious sexual harassment by a staff member, of a staff member by the controller of the UN, the Deputy Secretary General, and she won. So I found her, and I told her my story, and she came out from behind her desk, and I was mentally, psychologically, I was very damaged by this process. And she came out from behind her desk, and she took my hand, and she said, "You are the most heroic person I've met in real life. I would love to take this case." So for the next 7 years, we battled the UN in its own internal justice system. And because the media had vilified me as a corrupt UN official, that was the narrative. But I worked very diligently with the media to get them to understand what I was really doing, which was blowing the whistle on this massive corruption scheme that involved my senior UN colleagues, the ones who were orchestrating the retaliation against me. And on Christmas Day in 2008, the first story that actually had my side came out in the Wall Street Journal on the front page. And that was the first time that my voice in this was heard. The next time was after we started winning in the UN Dispute Tribunal, the lower level court. We kept on winning and winning and winning and winning and winning, and the journalists started taking note of the fact that somehow this David was beating Goliath. And so the story changed. Nothing had changed for me, but for the media, this had suddenly, the pendulum had swung dramatically in the other direction, and I was romanticized as a heroic figure. And that was helpful, of course, because then I could get more positive attention. I was contacted at that point by GAP, one of Samantha's predecessors, who asked if they could help with advocating for me in Washington and elsewhere. And I said, that would be great. We organized a press conference across the street from the UN in what was then known as the UN Plaza Hotel. And I'd never done one of these before. So Shelley Walden from GAP and I, and my kids were there and my closest of our friend, and 3 people showed up. So I thought, well, this is not good. But I had written to John Kerry, the Secretary of State at the time, saying that the U.S. should withhold or hold the UN to account for its horrible treatment of whistleblowers, of which my case was a perfect example. I was the first official UN whistleblower, so all the machinery that was designed by the U.S., imposed on the UN, which resisted it, the UN called it, "We don't want to encourage a culture of snitches." That was how the UN thought about whistleblowing and still does. So Kerry didn't respond. I knew he wouldn't. But it did get quite a lot of attention in the media. And so we had this press conference. Nobody showed. But I didn't realize that it was being live streamed, and there were more than 50 journalists from around the world who were listening to it all, and the story became a global story overnight. It was covered in 72 countries, partly because it was the UN, and translated into at least 20 languages. Chinese, it was in Portuguese in Brazil and Portugal, and on. So it got a lot of momentum. In the end, we won at the lower court level in a quite dramatic judgment, and the UN appealed the decision to the UN Appeals Tribunal, which has an astonishingly high rate of reversals of the lower court judgments. I think it's 70, 80, 90%. I mean, it's much higher than one would expect. I mean, can you imagine that you have a court system where one level decides something and then those decisions are reversed at 80 or 90%? I mean, it says something about either the lower court judges being totally incompetent or the upper court judges not really taking the time to look into the cases before them, which was clearly the case for me. The latter was clearly the case, because when we did the hearing, 2 of the judges looked out the window the entire time. Only one judge paid attention, so their minds were made up. And when the decision came down, in which I lost, the decision was made on the fact that I had failed to, the facts were not at issue or challenged, but that I had failed to file the requisite paperwork to have access to the justice system at the outset of my trial. And as the dissenting judge pointed out, that the procedure that I had neglected had not existed until more than a year after I filed my case. So it was the retroactive application of a procedure that didn't exist when my case was filed, which is, again, a travesty of justice. They did award me legal fees, which was something. But I was then terminated, my career of 28 years at an end. I suggested there were other alternatives to immediate termination, because I was relatively close to retirement, to put me on a special leave without pay, so I would qualify for a pension in 20-something months or something like that. The UN said absolutely not, and I was whisked out the door, and that was the end of it. But it wasn't really the end of it. But I'll stop there for the moment. That is sort of how my particular case wound up.
I think I just wanted to point out that if you did see the film yesterday evening, what ends up happening to people, so thinking about what Jim was raising concerns about it was serious corruption that was funds that were siphoned away from infrastructure projects that were there to help support a war-torn country. John O'Brien in the film last night was raising concerns about corruption again and funding, but around climate mitigation. There's another whistleblower who was raising concerns about how the UN responds to requests for names of dissidents who are appearing before the Human Rights Council, and that names of Chinese dissidents were given to the Chinese government. And this was in some ways at the beginning of the world waking up to perhaps some very serious problems and discrimination, and much worse against the Uyghur community. So people are raising things that, if you think about the ability to raise something for people to look into it, to address it, it just seems very clear. And then this system that Jim tried to describe, you have to learn about, and you end up fighting every administrative rule, and you are dealt with, everything gets parceled out, so you end up fighting small facts, limited issues. And I wanted to turn now to Mark. You represent, maybe to perhaps sort of say your background a little bit with the UN, but also you are president both of the UNFSU and UNISERV. We have another member here, Aitor Arauz, who's the president of the United Nations Staff Union, General Secretary of UNISERV, who's here. Around the world, unions have both been good with this and not so good with this. What is the issue for you as representing staff members? What has become an area of concern for you? And what are sort of what the actual issues within the UN that you think that whistleblowing is a particular issue that the UN needs to address now? What's sort of the response from the staff side, and why is this now becoming quite an issue for you?
Thank you, Anna. So just a little background on myself as well. I'm 30 years in this organization, started at a very early age, and very early on in my career recognized the injustice, which got me into staff representation, and I've been involved in that one way or another throughout my career. This is the second time I'm doing this at the senior level of the union as the president of a field staff union that represents UN international staff that work in peacekeeping and special political missions. And then, 2 years ago, became president of the federation, UNISERV, which represents staff from a number of different staff unions and associations. So it includes Aitor's union, the New York UN Staff Union. It also includes UNDP, UNFPA, UN Women, UNOPS, and UNESCO, and my union, the UN Field Staff Union. I got into staff representation because of the injustices that I saw, and I have seen it throughout my career. The culmination of us now sitting here, I think, was when we had some involvement with the issues that have recently arose around UNOPS, the UNOPS fiasco, I like to call it. It's very clear also that from various surveys that the UN carries out over the last couple of years, staff engagement surveys, for instance, that staff don't have trust or faith in the system. We know, I think internally, that a lot of stuff goes unreported simply because staff don't feel confident that either something will be done or that they will be protected. So there's an issue of trust and fear of retaliation. And then the mechanisms that are in place not functioning as they should. So for the UN Secretariat, because you need to recognize also there are differences between what applies to UN Secretariat as well as what applies to other UN organizations, such as UNDP, which have their own policies. And this is another issue, something across the UN common system, that's where things start to fail even more, because there is no overriding principle that applies throughout the UN common system, and this is by and large because of the different structures of the various special UN organizations that have their own governing bodies, etc., etc. My union, we recently ran a survey amongst our staff, for instance, asking our staff whether they feel comfortable to report wrongdoing and whether they believe they would be protected against retaliation, and the vast majority says absolutely not. And then we hear and we know, stuff that goes around in the corridors, things about senior leaders that misbehave, and that behavior goes on for years, and there's no action taken. Staff come to us and want to report wrongdoing. The first thing they say is, but keep my name out of it. I don't want to, so it's very tricky also for us, how, as staff reps, how do we engage on this with senior management? How do we resolve these problems? Policies are there, but a policy is great. You have a wonderful policy, but if the mechanisms and the systems are not in place to enforce the policies, that's when things fall down. So we got a lot more engaged as UNISERV because of UNOPS, mostly because we recognize that, so when it comes to a small, relatively small entity or organization, and someone reports wrongdoing within that entity and it involves the senior leadership across the board, it becomes very tricky. So even those responsible for the internal oversight will not go after the head of the organization, not easily anyway, and that's what happened there. So then it was referred back to the UN, who carried out a preliminary investigation, and the next thing that happened was they decided there was no prima facie case for retaliation, which was requested, and it was sent back to UNOPS. And at that stage, the whistleblower was basically blown. And we see these things happening again and again. And so as staff representatives, we want things to change. And we've been working towards change. But having worked in the UN for 30 years, I realize and recognize how difficult it is to change things in this organization and how long it takes. I started doing staff representation at early age. I'm now at the end of my career, and I'm hoping to affect some change, so that's why we're here. We recognize that the pressure needs to come from inside and outside the organization in order to facilitate and create the what's the word?
Impetus.
Impotence to make it happen. That's it. Yeah.
And that's certainly our experience as well. Jim?
You can say it. What is the UNOPS fiasco? Because many people may not know.
So for those that don't know what happened in UNOPS, it relates around a investment scheme that was set up called S3I or something like that. That was the aim of that was to put money together and to fund projects such as affordable housing, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, this has been all over the news and started with a former UN official actually blogging about this, then got picked up by the New York Times. And it was actually only at that stage that action started to be taken. And so this is another pattern that we see, particularly when it comes to these high-level fraud cases or high-level officials that, behave in a way that is inconsistent with the way we're expected to behave. That the reaction of the UN is usually to let's try and keep a lid on it. Let's avoid reputational damage, etc. And so this kind of stuff has been going on for years, and so the perception lives that when you are at high level in this organization, you enjoy impunity. And that's a perception that continues to live, and we need to break that assumptions. I mean, the actions have shown that, yes, this is exactly what happens. They try to push things away and protect the UN, and then only when it's driven into a corner so far that they can no longer deny, then things come out in the open, and then the damage is far greater. So I think that, as Jim has said, you know, we don't hate this organization. We're in this organization because we believe in it, and having a good whistleblower system can prevent these kinds of things from getting to a stage where it has become such a big scandal. So I think it's in the organization's interest to change this culture, to make the UN credible, and achieve what it's set out to achieve.
We hope to come back to a few of the solutions, or at least some of the key areas to begin to construct a response. Aitor, is there anything you would like to say at this point, or do you want to?
Thank you, Anna. Sorry. I'm Aitor Arauz. I'm currently the president of the New York Staff Union, the United Nations Staff Union in New York. So my constituents are all the staff of United Nations headquarters. The issues here, we don't see as much of the kind of fraud and corruption that goes on in field operations, where oversight is definitely a challenge. But we do see things from the policy perspective, from the central oversight. And I absolutely concur with Mark. I've been in staff representation now at the leadership level of the union for 3 going on 4 years. And I've seen whistleblower cases across the spectrum. I have seen the system work very, very well, promptly, people being protected, being taken care of, being moved. And I've seen the absolute opposite. People just being completely sort of cases similar to Jim's. Not at the Secretariat, in other organizations, but as Mark pointed to, we all work under the UN emblem, and tarnishing the UN emblem tarnishes us all. The media, global constituents, donors, don't make a distinction between the Department of Economic and Social Affairs at the UN Secretariat and the UNDP and UNOPS and UN Women and UNAIDS. The headline is fraud and corruption at the UN, whistleblower run out of town. And that's what we have to address. Something that's always really struck me is, why is the first reflex to keep a lid on it? And I think there's an element of generational change here. I think some of the senior officials came up at a time when you could get away with covering things up, when you could just brush them under the carpet and you could control the message and you could control what came out in the media. That is not the world we live in anymore. Things will come out, and as Mark said, the damage is going to be a lot worse when you've tried to cover things up. Aside from obviously the human trauma and the human suffering that's caused to the individuals, the very brave individuals who should be honored and who should be respected. And the fear of retaliation is real. Something very specific about the UN is individual managers have huge control over the staffing decisions, so staff selection, hiring, recruitment, promotion. That's one thing that we're working very hard from the unions to change. And that is we call that control over people's careers the silent killer in terms of fear of retaliation. Nobody is going to ever speak up if they know that the people that they're reporting have full control over their careers. That in itself is an instant gag. So that's one thing we need to change. People need to know that they work for the UN, and that if they report misconduct by a specific manager, the UN will protect their careers and their jobs, not their manager. That happens in some cases. We have seen good instances where people are taken care of, but in other instances, the corrupt manager still has a say on whether the person is retained or is dismissed. And that's absolutely heartbreaking to watch, and it's also extremely damaging to the organization. So what we're trying to work on now from the unions is, what mechanisms can we put in place to make to shift that calculation. These are rational actors. They're extremely intelligent, talented, ambitious people who are making these choices. And this is a choice they have to make. So we have to put in place the measures to make that rational choice fall on the side of addressing the issue as soon as possible from the source, protecting the whistleblowers, and holding senior managers or middle managers, whoever it is that is engaging in fraud and corruption, to account. And I think that's what we need to focus on. And these testimonies and these sessions are extremely valuable in really pointing out the risks and the damage that is done when this doesn't work, and an incentive to make sure that we find the systems to make this work. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you so much, Aitor. I think that really raises it puts the issues really nicely. It humanizes it, but it also puts it within the accountability mechanisms. What I found so striking, and I find so striking with the people that we've worked with over the years, is whistleblowers are the ones that actually really believe in the organization. They're doing their jobs, and they're absolutely shocked. I mean, a lot of us go into organizations saying, there's some good people, some bad people, there's a bit of gray. These people are shocked, and they're put into a position where they're fighting for their professional survival, on top of just trying to get the issue addressed. And then people blame them for sometimes mixing those two things up, because they actually are conflated by the organization. And then they have to navigate as a lawyer, one of the most confusing administrative regulatory systems that I have ever come across, and it's called the internal justice system. So Sam is a staff litigator and the head of the international program at the Government Accountability Project, which is one of the longest established organizations dedicated to protecting whistleblowers since the late 1970s. So these are the gurus of whistleblowing protection for us in the community. And what I'd like to say is that it's one of the few organizations, and partly because of the UN and other multilateral bodies being based in Washington, who have done their best on very limited resources to represent whistleblowers through the system. So Sam, could you describe a little bit this journey, as Jim calls it, into the magical mystery tour of the UN justice system and what people then have to face?
That's a great way to describe the magical mystery tour. I'm going to use that. The UN has always claimed that, while the Secretariat has its own whistleblower policy and procedures, the other agencies, funds, and programs have a separate but equal policy available to them. And as I think Jim started to talk about earlier, the United States did end up passing in its Consolidated Appropriations Act a provision that said that if the UN didn't have and implement best practice whistleblower policies, that they would withhold 15% of their funds. And this also applied to other IGOs. And we saw that when the US applied this, it worked. But they were reluctant to apply it against the United Nations. And it was sort of this separate but equal argument that the UN used to say that it had these protections in place. So I just wanted to share some cases that I think illustrate some of the reoccurring problems that we see in the system and in the policies, and just to show how they are unequal in many respects. So in the case of Vincent Smith, he was an employee at the UN International Civil Aviation Organization. And as a whistleblower, as the director of the administration bureau, he oversaw the IT department, and he discovered that there was a cybersecurity breach, and the investigations involved the destruction of evidence, that the cybersecurity breach had been undetected for a long time, and he saw that the investigation into it just wasn't being taken seriously, and there was a lot of obstruction of the investigation. And so he raised the concerns with his boss internally, and his concerns were ignored. And so he decided to go to the council, and he raised some complaints. The Secretary General was retaliating against him, and he, at this point, could only go to the council as a whistleblower, which is really not an appropriate procedure for whistleblowers. And so he finally decided to go public to the media after things weren't going anywhere internally. And so finally he felt that the retaliation was so bad he had to go on a medical leave of absence. And so what happened in his case is that he was eventually terminated for pretextual reasons because his wife was in his kind of chain of command, and both him and his wife had offered various alternatives to get her out of his chain of command, and the Secretary General failed to accept any of those, but it was really on her to provide an alternative, and so she just didn't provide any alternatives. And so she said, oh, by way of, violating this conflict in the reporting chain, I'm gonna have to decide, who to fire, and decided to fire the whistleblower. But Vincent Smith had challenged that there was a whistleblower policy because the council had passed a whistleblower policy that directed the Secretary General to implement it into their staff code. And so what she did was just neglect to integrate it with the staff code. And so we argued that there really was a whistleblower policy, and the United States said, well, if there's no whistleblower policy, then we're going to withhold 15% of our funds. And so she threatened to kick the United States off of the council of the Civil Aviation Organization, but didn't. And the United States threatened to withhold 15% of the funds, so they all agreed there is a whistleblower policy after all, and therefore, the staff at ICAO have whistleblower rights. However, that doesn't address the issue of due process procedures. So there is an internal review board at the Civil Aviation Organization, but they can only make recommendations to the Secretary General. So basically, they just make recommendations to the person who made the decision to potentially maybe overturn their own decision. And so it was just inherently powerless and conflicted and not a neutral first instance procedure. And so there was a case at the UN Appeals Tribunal, the Hefberger case, that said that because at the ICAO you can appeal directly to the Appeals Tribunal from the Internal Review Board. So this case said that it's not receivable at the Appeals Tribunal until the International Civil Aviation Organization corrects the issues with its internal justice system. And so they kind of reconstituted the Internal Review Board to make sure that they could make decisions and had the authority to do that and to address the conflicts of interest with the Secretary General. However, another issue is that at the Civil Aviation Organization, the employees are not allowed to get their own external counsel. And so they can only be represented by a staffer or former staffer. But that's a problem because, well, how many people are going to be lawyers? And how many people are going to be trained in this special area of law? And how many people are going to want to represent someone against their employer, essentially? So there's a conflict in and of itself, and that's a lot for someone to take on in addition to their full-time jobs. And so this is an issue that was not fixed in the amendments at ICAO. And so Vincent Smith, for some time, was represented by his wife, who is a professional translator and does not have legal training, versus ICAO had two high-powered attorneys representing them in their case. And this is a pattern that we see in a lot of whistleblower cases. I also wanted to mention the case of Aitor Arauz, who was the UN African Union Mission in Darfur spokesperson. And she disclosed that her boss, Mr. Karen Chalian, who was controlling the information and communications with UN headquarters, was withholding information about the attacks of Sudan against the people of Darfur, the massive rapes and killings and acts of violence that were happening. And basically, she was suppressed and told that she couldn't share this information, and she was retaliated against for challenging it. And she eventually gave testimony to US Congress, and she shared with Congress that after 8 months, she felt like the cover-up was clear, and she feared for her safety because of the threats that she received from her boss, Mr. Chalian. And so she left Sudan, and she wrote an end-of-mission report, and she asked DPKO and the Office of Investigative Services to look into what happened. And they didn't respond, they didn't investigate, they didn't do anything about it. And I think, if you look at these cases, you see that there's retaliation against the whistleblowers, and they end up losing their jobs, and you see this purge of ethical employees, and then you see a lack of accountability. At the International Civil Aviation Organization today, the information security is at a low maturity level to this day, and that threatens the security of civil aviation all around the world. And so these problems are still ongoing. In the case of Darfur and the cover-ups there was also a lack of accountability. She did eventually go to the International Criminal Court to provide evidence and ask them to prosecute. But I also wanted to share the case of Anders Compass, who is the Director of Field Operations at the UN High Commission for Human Rights in the Central African Republic. And he had exposed that French peacekeepers were abusing children as young as 8 years old. And the amount of sexual abuse was shocking, and he had provided evidence of this. And similarly, there was a lack of investigation, and instead they turned into investigating him for wrongdoing. And so he was eventually cleared, which is terrific, but at this point he was so disenchanted with everything he'd experienced that he ended up resigning. And while eventually, after there was media and a lot of public pressure around it, it was finally the Secretary General who opened up an investigation, and it was eventually the peacekeepers who were turned over to the French authorities. Unfortunately, they found that there was inadequate evidence for them to prosecute, so there was no accountability for the peacekeepers. And so, I think this is definitely a trend that we see that's very concerning. So just to kind of summarize some common trends that we see in these and other cases is we find that fundamentally there's an inequality of arms. A lot of whistleblowers don't have legal counsel. Part of that reason is because of the UN. You can't reclaim attorney's fees in cases if you win your case. So few lawyers are willing to take these cases. And so that is definitely part of the problem. And you also see the UN having, several sometimes high-powered attorneys representing them on their cases. There's also a lack of due process procedures. Government Accountability Project worked on a letter to the Internal Justice Council with nearly 50 recommendations for how to fix the due process and policy issues that we see at the UN. There's also a failure to investigate when whistleblowers make disclosures. There's no action or response. Sometimes they turn to public channels, but the UN only allows whistleblowers to report in public channels in very limited circumstances, and there are rules that say that they can't make disclosures to the public. So if they do and they are violating that rule, they have to make their defense that they qualified under the whistleblower policy under those exceptions, and the UN can still determine that they didn't. So it's very risky for whistleblowers to go publicly. We also see that there's a lot that I think member states can do. We saw that the US being tough on whistleblower rights under the Consolidated Appropriations Act was very effective, but unfortunately the United States did remove the 15% penalty from appropriations law. We did try to get Congress to reconstitute it in some form. However, this did not make it into the last iteration of the bill. So unfortunately, it's really not the time for member states to be weakening their positions to the UN on the importance of the protection of whistleblowers through strong policies and independent, credible due process procedures. So So if there's anything I could conclude with, it's really that I think member states need to pick up their role in asking more from the UN and asking for investigations and accountability and solutions to what's clearly not working.
Thank you so much, Sam. You were going to mention, and maybe it would be maybe a good time, about the judge in Emma Riley's case who ended up going public. Did you want to speak about that one at all, or just mention it briefly? Because Emma Riley is a whistleblower who is dogged in her pursuit of justice and using every avenue of regulation and system. And what is amazing is, as it can start to work, and under Jim's, he was like the first whistleblower. He made it work through hard work and gritted teeth. He made that system work for himself, but the cost is far too high. But if it does start to work sometimes, then some of these other administrative systems come in, and on their face may be neutral, but in the context of these cases look very, very fishy. And there is a judge that has talked about that.
Judge Rowan Downing essentially became a whistleblower himself, and he talked about the fact that the Office of Administration and Justice, the Office of Legal Affairs, it sits within the Secretariat, so it's inherently conflicted. And he said that the OHA was interfering with how the tribunal manages its work, but he also says that they're sharing an office with the dispute tribunals. So that in and of itself is a conflict, a pretty obvious one. And so, and in some level, the tribunal judges themselves, work for management. They control aspects of their work and their salaries. And I think that there's not appropriate independence. I do think that the ILO, for those who have jurisdiction to go to the ILO, tends to be more favorable and perhaps more independent in enforcing labor rights and whistleblower cases, but it's only in very narrow, limited circumstances that some may be able to avail themselves of the ILO administrative tribunal. So he basically blew the whistle that there was obstruction of justice and fundamental issues that still to this day have not been addressed and need to be addressed. And there's issues with discovery because the agency has all of the evidence that the whistleblower needs to prove their case, and then there's no power that the judges have procedurally to compel the agency to produce all of the relevant evidence. So it's really just set up for failure structurally.
For this room and this conference and the anti-corruption work you do around the world, one of the big key issues is independence of judiciary, and we give a lot of recommendations outward, as does parts of the UN system. And this is where, in a way, we have to go back to really basic. Some of this is so simple, it's sort of astonishing, because the independent judicial system, we know that has problems. It can be undermined in lots of ways in different countries, but it is independent of other parts of the decision-making system. We are supposed to have separation of powers. And the best will in the world, the best people running the UN wanting it to work, doesn't mean that you still need to have separation of powers. We need to be accountable to others. I need to be accountable to other people. People who work in NGOs need to do good whistleblowing policies. Big aid organizations have also had problems with whistleblowing. This is universal. This is about accountability. It's about good mechanisms and thinking about it appropriately. The UN is not unique. It is run by people, and we have a system that is absolutely not designed to support the UN in doing its work well. They don't have the right tools to do this well. Jim, did you want to respond briefly to?
Yes, with what Samantha has mentioned, in particular, As the first whistleblower, official UN whistleblower, and of course having received quite a lot of publicity, I am often one of the first ports of call for whistleblowers in the UN system when they want to know what to expect. So whether it was Aisha or Anders and all the ones that Samantha has mentioned, I've been involved in talking to them over the years. And Aisha, who I respect and did marvelous work, was clearly she was told to shut up about the UN's role, the complicity of the UN in covering up the genocide by the Sudanese government in Darfur, and she told me that she resigned rather than go through what I went through. That was her. She had decided from the outset that she would have to quit because she couldn't withstand the abuses that the UN would foist upon her that she had observed in my case. Fortunately for her, she won a major award for her whistleblowing here in Washington some years later. But her career, and even now, she is still suffering some of the after effects from the trauma of her whistleblowing. Anders Kompas got so fed up with the UN's lack of action on the pedophilia with the boys, the French peacekeepers in Central African Republic, and that UNICEF, the UN Office of Human Rights, did absolutely nothing on this for 2 years, that he finally did it himself. And that violated some notional confidentiality rule that the UN put in place, again, trumped up charges to go after him, and it was done at the highest levels of Geneva. It was not done in the field. This persecution was in Geneva. It was at UN headquarters, Geneva. A major problem still exists. Some of the same people who were involved in that have just been rotated around into other senior positions. Some small fry suffered some consequences for it, but that is still ongoing. The same people, just in different positions, some of them even higher. Nobody suffers consequences from whistleblowing except the whistleblowers. That's not unique to the UN system, but it is absolutely the message to UN staff. What's happening now is that, and I get this from very reliable sources, is that when the UN smells that there's a problem that could be very messy, they negotiate NDAs and pay people off. And I know this from people who were involved in the process directly. So they've taken a page from corporate America and decide rather than have this become public, they keep it private, don't address the problem, give some cash to the whistleblower and make the person sign. So you can keep your job if you sign an NDA. So that practice has been imported into the UN Secretariat in New York. Finally, with respect to the U.S. law that Samantha mentioned, it's always interesting to me as a progressive Democrat that my travails were always harder with the Democrats than with the Republicans, probably because the Republicans used me as a poster child for all their anti-UN fervor, and I have no sympathy with that. But the Democrats were always giving me this ridiculous excuse that, oh, the UN is always under so much attack we don't want to make it even more vulnerable. So they came up with this ridiculous rationale to gut the law. It's too broad an instrument, blah, blah, blah. It's too messy, it's too difficult. We want to reduce the percentage to make it negligible. We want to have it focused very narrowly on the department which is involved in the transgression, despite the fact that it's a systemic problem throughout the entire organization. The whistleblowing protection is not part of the department that's the problem, it's part of the organization. So that it was a nonsensical reason, and the State Department has been really awful in dealing with this issue over the years. And I've made that point over and over and over to them. You have to have the courage to actually impose these things more aggressively. Anders Kompas benefited from the fact that the then U.S. ambassador to the UN, who's now a senior official in this administration, I won't name her, although she's in charge of a major U.S. development agency, spoke to him and said, if you continue to go after this guy, we will impose the 15% cut. So rather than fix the problem, they stopped bothering Kompas to some extent, but they decided, what would we do without 15% of our budget? So they didn't fix the problem. They figured, oh, we're going to live without the 15%. And so what programs are we going to cut? Let's cut the ones that the U.S. is most interested in. That was the reaction on the 38th floor under I can't remember whether it was Ban Ki-moon or Guterres, but it was it's the same. This is a Aitor talked about a generational issue. The generation, as I said last night, the problem that my lawyer had initially addressed sexual harassment happened under Javier Perez de Cuellar. We had oil for food under Kofi Annan. We had my case and so many others under Ban Ki-moon. All the ones that we saw last night are under Guterres. This has been years and years and years and unaddressed. The fifth committee, which is the administrative committee, and I've said this in my proposals for how to fix this, made up of mainly of diplomats and politicians, and I've said that you cannot entrust management of anything to diplomats and politicians because their moral compasses are so twisted. You need to have, and they're not skilled in these areas, so you need to have real managers, real organizational managers who know what they're doing and know what to look for. So as long as you have these positions staffed by diplomats and politicians, you are only going to get half measures and false choices and bad and false dilemmas. You need to have real professionals in these oversight roles in the General Assembly. And the solution lies in there. And we haven't talked about that, but we can talk about that shortly.
Well, we need a double session. Marie, I'm so sorry. There you are at the end, being very, very patient. But this is a very complicated, but also very real issue that people are not only passionate about, but we can now see that there is a community that's saying this, and whistleblowers should not. And I said this to Jim more than once, and I've said it to other whistleblowers. I really love whistleblowers. I want them to survive. I don't want to have to rely on them to keep my hospital safe, to make sure the money isn't siphoned off. It's not fair that individuals are speaking for all of us, and that's why we're all here in the room today, and this is why we're coming together. You get stronger in communities, and you get to really look at what the systemic issues are. So these individuals are not fighting as individuals, a system, and made to feel like they're insane because the system works against them. And you can see people starting to relax when they're with other people and just go, it wasn't all about me, but that's how they're made to feel. Marie, we're talking about, so Transparency International chapters. I noticed John Devitt is here from TI chapter, and he was our first chair of the Whistleblowing International Network. So chapters are very important around the world, working with whistleblowers, and many of them advising whistleblowers. The TI at the Secretariat level does a lot of the research and pulling together the learning and the policy. And you look to monitor how the whistleblower protection laws and rules are being applied and advocate for actual better implementation. What are some of the key institutional, because we got lawyers, I'm a lawyer, I know that if, and this is I'm going to be direct, I know that if all you have is a law, baby, you're screwed. So what else do we need? And what are some of the key institutional practices? And again, we're talking about the UN, and there's some unique characteristics of the UN, but some of these are very, very familiar to all of us who've been working with organizational practice for many years. So Marie, go ahead.
Thank you, Anna. I mean, I think it has been mentioned maybe before, but we found that given the size and the complexity of the UN and the high-risk environment it operates in, it has relatively few reports, internal reports of misconducts and fraud. And that in itself already shows that the system is not working, and that even though they do have some policies, I mean, that's just not enough. Actually, the policy, I mean, we always say it's like the law, it's the first step. Of course, you have to have it right, that's really important, and there are some things to say about that as well. They're not up to standards, not really up to standards, but it's also about how they're, about the organizational setup, the culture, all of that's really important to ensure that these policies are implemented how they're meant to be and that they actually work in practice. And that's where we see that there is maybe an issue at the UN. And just looking at, for example, in terms of the retaliation policy, because we've seen that the fear of negative consequences, the fear of retaliation, it's been one of the main reason why people don't report, and I think after all the cases we mentioned, I mean, rightfully so, they have reason to fear this. but it's also, so their own survey, they conducted a survey of their staff, and they said that more than 1 in 10% who actually did report corruption and other issues internally, they did suffer consequences. They suffered some sort of retaliation. And of those, less than half even bothered to complain about it to the proper authorities, so often it's the ethics office. And even when they did report retaliation to the ethics office, there was like a real lack of confidence that it will go anywhere, that there will be any positive outcome. And again, with good reasons, because the UN own statistics shows that only 7% of the complaints received are considered by the ethics office to be cases of retaliation on average. So that's quite low. And of course, like, it doesn't even say whether the measures that were actually taken then to protect the person were effective or not. That's also like a whole conversation in itself. But just looking at why is that number so low, and then there are numbers of reasons, but maybe some of them are due to the policies themselves, and some are due to how they actually applied and about the organizational setup. And for example, for a start, a majority of the UN anti-retaliation policy, they do not even cover consultants, contractors, interns, junior professional officers, or the volunteers. Even though those like non-staff category, they constitute almost half of the UN workers. So that's already half of the people who can report issues, but they can report issues, but they're not eligible to protection. That's a major flaw already in the policies themselves. And then another issue is that the evidence threshold that the whistleblowers must meet for their retaliation complaints to be just forwarded for investigation is very high. So in practice, most of the complaints are not even referred for investigation. Because most UN policies, they require the whistleblowers to show that reporting wrongdoing was a contributing factor in causing the alleged retaliation. But I mean, how is the whistleblower supposed to prove that? I mean, usually when you receive a negative performance review, or if your contract did not renew, your manager is not going to say, well, that's because you blew the whistle. I mean, that would be too easy. So they will say it's because there were other reasons. They will come up with other reasons. So that's why, we say it should be for them to clearly and convincingly demonstrate that the detrimental measures was actually in no way linked to the whistleblowing. And I think that's really important. And so the whistleblower should just show that they have blown the whistle, and then, well, things happened. And then the investigation comes into place, and then the investigation finds out whether, there was indeed linkage. I mean, going further, it's also like the system is very reactive. It's about, what happens if you suffer retaliations. Like, no, actually, you should try to prevent retaliation from happening. So there should be some risk assessment put in place. There should be some supporting measure that exists before the person actually does suffer corruption. And in terms of maybe another example of why maybe the organizational setup doesn't really function is the issue of the independence of the authorities that are in charge of both investigating reports of wrongdoing and also those who are protecting whistleblowers, because you do need to have sufficient independence to fulfill those missions without any undue influence or interference. And at the UN, that's an issue in itself. For example, if you look at the Secretariat Ethics Office, appointments and funding is under the control of the Office of the Secretary General. And they're also the one writing the performance evaluation for the director of the Ethics Office. And it's the same in many of the specialized agencies where the Ethics Office report to the head of the organization in question. And this leaves them vulnerable to interference by senior management. And there are like similar issues with the investigative body. And that really came out very clearly in the UNOPS scandal that was mentioned earlier, because there has been an independent review that was released like a few weeks ago, and they clearly found that the whistleblowers report that like the whistleblower who alerted to the risks that ended up materializing, and they alerted before the risky investment were made. So they could have, that if they had actually taken step at that moment, that could have been avoided, like the 60 million or 20 to 60 million loss, that could have been avoided if they had investigated at the time. But because the responsible bodies for investigating, like their mandate made it very difficult to investigate a high-level UN official, nothing happened until like really problems started piling up, and that was at that point, well, the money was lost and it was too late. So that really shows like the importance of that. And I mean, we see that this like level of independence, we already say it's important in private organization, in public organization, in countries, but at the UN, it's even more important because everything is under one roof. There is no outside oversight system. So that's one of the system. And I think maybe to conclude, because we do want to open the floor maybe for questions, I think it's really time that the UN understand that whistleblowing is not just something they need to do because, well, the donors tell them to do it. It's like they benefit from it. It's really important. We all benefit from the UN having a good whistleblowing system. Because it really allows to, as I said earlier, to detect and correct those issues early, so that damage to the public interest first, like can be limited, and all the cases we talked about, public health. We talked about like if you saw the movie yesterday, it's health, it's environment, it's like we're talking sexual abuse and things like that you can stop from keeping happening, and you can also, like, if it's like detected early, you can already try to help the victim and redress the system early on, instead of letting it go on and on and on, and because you don't want to deal with it. But it's also very important for the the organization, because it helps them themselves in a more looking inward type of way. But in the end, if you don't have the system in place, you have really risk of serious financial losses, as like the UNOPS case showed, and really like lasting reputational harm, and that will result in public and like in decreasing the public trust, and at the time where like the international order instability is seriously challenging. All this like this multilateralism and global governance, I think that maintaining and even rebuilding in some cases the legitimacy, the credibility, and the trust into the UN system is really important. It's paramount, and I think effective whistleblowing system is one of the elements to get there.
Thank you so much, Marie. I know that Jim has a response, but I did want to ask Mark, is there anything you'd like to say, or Aitor, now that we've gone around the houses a bit with all the various elements that we've picked up on?
Yeah. So the independence of the internal justice system as a whole, including ethics and whatnot, this is, we agree, it's a huge issue. But one of the key questions that we are pondering is, how do we establish more independence from the UN, from its member states? How would we achieve something like that? Where would we find the political, will to do that? And how can we make that work? Something I wanted to point out as well is that for staff, as was pointed out, you need to get your own counsel. Although the UN has what is called the Office of Staff Legal Assistance, it's very meagerly resourced, and there as well the problem is that these are UN staff, those lawyers. They do excellent work, I have to say. They do support our staff often very well, but they are staff at the end of the day, and many of them hope to have a career in this organization. So the pressure on them that could be exerted, of course, is quite fathomable. Closer to my mouth, okay. So that is another part of the puzzle. The independence of those that support our staff legally is also could be drawn into question. Another thing I wanted to point out is that one thing that has, we believe, exacerbated some of the lack of accountability, if you will, is so the SG's reform were based on delayering the organization and decentralizing some of the decision making, and particularly providing delegation of authority down to heads of entities. And this is fine, I think, as a reform initiative to make the organization more nimble and whatnot, and all these wonderful terms, agile, etc., is a good initiative. But what is lacking, and where there is a clear lack, is the oversight and compliance capability to make sure that things don't happen under the radar is simply not there. And again, because of, the reasons given is because of lack of resources, et cetera, et cetera. So, things seem to be on a sliding scale downwards, unfortunately. So yeah, things need to improve dramatically. The independence of the entire justice system. By the way back when the internal justice system was reformed, I was actually part of that because I was then also staff rep. And the intent then was to make it much more independent, but it obviously didn't fly. And what we have now is better from what we had 20 years ago, when it was even far worse, I'm sure, as Jim recalls. So there have been reforms to the internal justice system, and I don't think anything should preclude it from happening again. These things need to be. There's been this lived experience, so lots of expertise. There is additional transparency out there. People are more aware, and I think we need to all work together to make these changes happen. Yeah.
And the other thing that definitely comes up in all the sessions around the UN is people really care. And they care about the UN working, and what this is about is giving the people in the UN the tools to make it work. And one of the things I'd like to mention is when you've got such a complicated system, we used to say always that negligence breeds negligence. So a bad decision then starts to make, the people involved might not, it looks to the whistleblower very much like and for some of them it is very much this, a concerted effort to shut them down and use every mechanism that they can to shut them down. But even if that's not happening, that's how it can be perceived, because every separate act is not, the people fail to see the journey a whistleblower has and to connect all the activity. It's happened in other cases, like in Antoine Deltour's case, in the LuxLeaks case. When you start to compartmentalize, it's like you are a whistleblower when you did this, and you're not a whistleblower when you did that, and the retaliation was about this. Unless you have the whole thing, you can't see the patterns that are there, and that's taken a lot of learning in a lot of our national jurisdictions, and that's why the film yesterday was so important, to really help the individuals themselves see that this is not all about them, it's a system that's shutting down on them, and for us to see that, because that's when we can start to make the systemic change and not get into the ridiculous discussion about how pure and honorable the whistleblower has to be in order to be listened to and heeded. Would you like to have a last word? And then I would really like, those of you who want to ask a question of this panel about what we're talking about today, if you'd like to come up to the mic, that would be great.
Yes, I think we've heard quite a lot about the justice system and the ethics office, and I just want to add a little word with respect to my case in investigations. After I managed to thread the tiny little needle to get through the prima facie requirements of being a whistleblower, et cetera, and yet with the in the internal oversight services investigation, where the investigator, who was someone I trained and worked with, which is probably conflicting, but was very much going in my favor for 8 or 9 months of the investigation, but then suddenly, a month or two later, turned completely against me and found this random acts by rogue actors finding. Many years later, in fact, in the last few months, someone with whom I'm in touch, who's in touch with that particular individual, told me that the investigator had told her that he was under pressure to change his finding, and he really regrets the fact that he did. And that's how it came to be random acts from a finding of retaliation. And so she asked me, how do you feel about this? And I said, I feel nothing. What am I supposed to feel? 6 or 7 or 8 years later, he admits what I knew had happened all along. I mean, it should have been in the moment. It's very easy to now say, oh, I should have, woulda, coulda, shoulda. But when the test of integrity was put to him, he failed. Ethics office, except for the fact that I made it through this particular narrow passageway, they fail whistleblowers almost completely, all the time. The justice system is horrific when it comes to most staff concerns, not at the lower level, but at the higher level. So all these mechanisms fail, and not just in the UN Secretariat, it's in every single one of the UN agencies. It's not unique to the Secretariat.
So we have some questions. So would you like to pose a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you very much. Thanks for this panel. I thought it was very interesting and actually very moving as well, your story, for example, Jim, and yours. Sorry to introduce myself. I'm Andrea Johnston. I work for KfW, that's the German Development Bank. And Germany, of course, is a member state of the UN. And KfW is a big donor, or on behalf of the German government. We work with basically all UN organizations. And maybe before I ask my question, I have to say I am a strong believer in the UN system in many countries, especially in conflict framework. It's more or less the only partners we can work with and via, so I strongly believe we need the UN system and we want to continue cooperation and work with them. And also, more on a general note, I believe if the UN didn't exist, we'd have to try and found them, and I'm a little bit pessimistic. I think in a world nowadays we wouldn't even manage to do this anymore. So I think we can all be thankful that the UN is there. However, listening to all this, I would think with grave cases like this, one would stand up and have major reforms which are so convincing that all member countries, all donors are very much convinced they can keep trusting the system. And this is my specific questions are here with regard to UNOPS, the UNOPS cases that you also mentioned, for example. And it's not just the 3SI, it's much more than this, because the KPMG report, which we only found because the single audit principle was not followed in this case, because normally we have the problem with the single audit principle, which doesn't allow donors to see the reports, the auditor's reports normally. We found that it is not just one case, it is a structural problem, it's a governance problem, it's a much larger problem. So, but obviously donors want to continue working with, for example, UNOPS and the other UN agencies. What is your recommendation? What can we do? What can we trust in? I mean, we saw that UNOPS management reacted, we think, relatively strongly, relatively convincingly, with a large action plan on changes that they will introduce in the next months, and I think it's actually worked for years that they have to do. And of course, we will follow up on this. We have to trust in this because we don't really have a choice. What is your recommendation to donors, to member states? What can we do? How can we try to support the system? I would really like to support the system.
So Marie would like to say something, and then I think there are other people. Maybe the whole panel would like to respond.
Yeah, no, I think that's the most important question. I think that's also why we're here, right? We want the UN to function. We want to help it function. And I think one of the very important message is that they shouldn't do it on their own behind closed door. Like the process needs to be transparent and it needs to be participatory. There needs to be civil society involved, like other experts from outside of the UN who have expertise to share. So of course I'm talking about us. I mean, like the NGOs, but also the trade unions, of course, but the academia. I mean, it can't be behind closed door. It has to be participatory. And I think that's my main message. And we've with GAP and with WIN, we've said again and again that we're available and we're really willing to work with them. So the invitation is definitely open there. But it has to be multi-stakeholder, involving member states, involving everyone.
There's a few points to respond to your question. One is I do think that the withholding of some percent, or even threatening to withhold some percent of funds until certain problems are addressed, is effective and can work. So I think this is a tool in the toolkit that should be used. Next is that we have like some 50 recommendations for things that can fix it, but I did want to bring up one case. This is so the UN has this external board of auditors that has 3 member states assigned to it. And there's this case right now, Chile is one of the countries on the external board of auditors. And the Office of the Comptroller has assigned auditors to be auditing UN agencies, funds, programs. And they have no requirement for the public sector accountants to be certified. And so you have engineers, architects, lawyers, people who are not accountants, people who are not certified auditors, now auditing the UN. And because there's no Freedom of Information Act type thing that we can apply to the UN to entitle us to access to information, member states especially depend on auditors and audits. And we found in the case there was a whistleblower, one of the auditors from Chile. And because she works for the government of Chile, she was not subjected or protected by the UN whistleblower policy. And she had complained that the people were unqualified, but there was also some many issues she found with the UN pension fund that the UN pension fund did not want disclosed. And one of the auditors was a lawyer who was complicit in suppressing the information at the acquiescence of the UN pension fund. And so this information didn't make it through to the member states, and it ended up, this case, because this whistleblower was retaliated against, it went to the court of Chile, where she did get some interim protection while there was an investigation, but actually just today, this morning, I learned she ultimately lost her case. And it's really important that speech like this is protected activity and that they're protected from retaliation. But I think that in the UN Board of Auditors, even though there may not be a requirement in country for these people to be certified accountants and auditors, that the Board of Auditors have a requirement imposed by the countries participating that they assign trained, qualified, certified auditors to participate, and that they be entitled to avail themselves to some sort of whistleblower protections so that they can be protected from gag orders that say that they can't disclose information and that they are allowed to work independently and objectively in doing their work without a fear of retaliation.
Yeah, so in the case of UNOPS, UNOPS is governed by an executive board that also deals with UNDP, UNFPA, etc., right? And action started happening when Finland decided to withdraw funding to all development activities. Holland, my country, followed suit to stop funding of UNOPS, and the US stopped funding UNOPS until this issue was resolved and reforms done. It was actually, I think, only then that they really sprung into action and started seriously looking at, making changes. Having said that, though, I think there were shortcomings in this particular case from the side of the board as well, who wasn't engaged enough, who wasn't looking at reports clearly enough to capture some of the shortcomings in their mechanisms and whatnot. So I would say that it's important for donors and countries, funding the UN and organizations to be much more engaged and closely look at, how are they doing their business, and to be much more up close and personal, because at the end of the day, this is what matters. The funding is what matters, because without it, they cannot implement anything. And that's at least one way to force accountability, as I see it.
Yes, I have worked very often with various boards, various agencies. This gets back to my earlier point that you can't entrust these important matters to diplomats and politicians who don't understand the documents that are put in front of them. 90% of the time, they don't understand, and they rely on the agency, which is engaged in the malfeasance or malpractice, for the documentation. And the whistleblowers, myself included, have seen numerous examples of false claims made by the agencies put forward to the donors which go unquestioned, including action plan for UNOPS, the action plan for UNDP, which is where there is still a nest of corruption that has not been addressed in headquarters. And it's been investigated, it's been swept under the carpet. So this is ongoing. What the UN is incapable of policing itself. All the agencies. So the suggestion that the whistleblowers have made to Gutierrez, who ignored it, was that there needs to be some body, some agency or some authority or some office that does not rely on post facto investigations like audits and investigations themselves, but is responsible for real-time oversight, including of the Secretary General, reporting independently to the General Assembly, that has teeth that can say, no, this is, because you can't trust the Secretaries General. You can't trust the entire Secretariat. I've always said, blow up the UN today and rebuild it the right way tomorrow. And I still say that. You cannot fix the organization as it currently stands. It's been tried and tried and tried and tried and tried, and it doesn't happen. It never happens, because the staff, especially at the senior levels, with the complicity of the donors, allow these malpractices to continue year in and year out, decade after decade. So one way of doing it is to remove the oversight and put it in an independent body of all the whistleblower protection function and the governance functions. The fifth committee is inadequate, but there needs to be some organization composed of professionals in management who understand the challenges that can actually address the issues that arise in terms of oversight in real time, including not making recommendations to the Secretary General. I wish that were possible. It's failed over and over across Secretaries General, across agencies. The UN system is incapable of policing itself, and the donors have done a horrible job in holding them to account.
Just one. Sorry. So Aitor would like to.
Thank you. A lot of the speakers have raised this question, and Jim raised it, this question of the moral ambivalence. We see, and Mark, how many times have we been in a room, not just with fraud and corruption and whistleblower protection, but malfeasance, misconduct, bad behavior on the part of senior officials in general. How many times have we been in a room with somebody and, high-ranking HR people who could do something about these things, and they just look at you with a stony face and say, the message is, reading between the lines, within the current power structures, yes, I understand, yes, I empathize, I know this is horrible, with the pressures we're under within the current power structures, there's nothing we can do about this. Head of an operation in a sensitive country, in a very sensitive operation, is harassing their staff, is sexually harassing their staff, is just an evil person. What do? Do you remove the head of the operation and the whole operation goes into tailspin, which many actors would love, or do you just stick to your guns? And that moral sort of tearing is there all the time. Change the power structures. Put structures in place where you don't have a bunch of people facing a moral dilemma. Do we do something about it? Or is it more convenient, more expedient, and more supportive of the UN's mission to think we can get away with brushing this under the carpet? Don't make that an option. And as Jim says, the oversight provided by the member states, with all due respect, is severely lacking. There never are consequences for the people at the top. And it's way beyond my pay grade, and that's why I'm really appreciative of collaboration with with the experts and the activists, we need together to find those mechanisms that will reverse the calculation, that will really reverse, that put structures in place so that moral ambivalence is no longer an option.
Just one more thing. Sorry, one more thing before we go to the next question. And I know we're going over time, so if you want to stay, that's great, because it's a good, and we won't go too far over time. But the stopping the money and then flowing the money in the right direction, right? So it's always going to be a carrot and a stick. But I absolutely agree. I mean, I like to think that I am a moral upright and I'll always make the right decision. It really helps me a lot if the systems help me make the right decision. And there are so many great people at the UN. But the idea that they don't have the systems, and then of course those who want an easy life, they work well in that system, and often they rise to the top because they don't question it. And the people who work really hard get so frustrated and upset and leave, and they too don't necessarily talk about it because they don't want to bring down the reputation of an organization that should be working. So I just throw that out there. Let's not rely on just goodwill, and I absolutely agree. Let's put the calculation somewhere else. Question, please.
Thank you so much. I think I'm going to try and bring together a lot of the points that you just raised, as well as some of the other discussions. We've got a partner discussion on kleptocracy. We've been talking about Russian pressure on overcoming sanctions. And at the moment, we have the grain and the fertilizer deal going through under the auspices of the Secretary General leadership with disinformation that will ultimately look to break and fund Putin's pockets directly if the UN goes forward with this deal that they're trying to negotiate to allow ammonia through. It goes straight into the pockets of someone that is under sanctions. What systems, in this immediate kind of moral dilemma, the disinformation that's been presented is either parts of Africa starve or we have to push this through. But at the root of it is a major flaw of disinformation that you don't need that Russian ammonia to go through. How do we support the whistleblowers that have that information within the UN system in something that is critical to a conflict? How do we put this out as an example to really try and address these structural issues and these structural flaws, when this is a perfect example, when you actually don't really have a moral dilemma, because what you have is you're being pushed to think you have a moral dilemma because someone's giving the UN the right information and because the executive office is feeling that that's the only information they have. So I'd love to just, in these immediate circumstances, what do you do when the system change will take a long time?
Mark or Aitor, do you have not an instant answer? I think absolutely, because what you're talking about is this is when. So, speaking to as a manager of 3 people, even those kind of situations, you do need processes. So you get to those questions, you're not there before. This is where the other mechanisms already have to exist. And that's where if we always talk about the crisis situations, we're only going to be responding in a kind of crazy way. We need to be doing this a really systemic look. And then you've got the mechanisms for when you're put in those positions, because that's what the UN's there to be, is to crisis respond. And we want them to be that, but it's like the procurement for COVID. You don't just throw everything out the window. Yes, you might get faster, and it's really good to know. Guess what? It can all be much more efficient. Thank you, we knew that already. But that doesn't mean you take away all the checks and balances. And so you're not put in this situation. I think that's what the answer is we're here to say, let's stop being in a crisis with other issues that absolutely don't need to be a crisis. And then you're ready when you actually have a crisis.
Good morning. I'll try to be short. Miodrag Milicevic, I do represent the NGO Active actually that comes from Kosovo and I'll try to do this, of course, and Republic of Serbia as well. Congratulations actually for the courage. Congratulations to all the panelists basically for presenting really very interesting actually facts and the way actually that most of us should really learn these days. As I said, I'll try to be very short. What we are hearing actually over the past 3 days, this is actually 2 days and this is the third day in a row, we hear actually there is a great need of the reform process for the UN, of course, from within and from the outside, of course, as a matter of support of the reform process. What I heard today, I'm not really hopeful that we're going to manage actually to see that anytime soon. So my question is actually to you, since there is a great need, actually, or genuine need, basically, to push for the oversight, the external oversight of the UN, of course, funding throughout the world, obviously. There is a genuine need, actually, to establish external oversight, not only on the top level, of course, but on the individual, every single field mission level. That's obviously something which is needed. How we convince the political or the policymakers, basically, to push for this process? Who's going to do this? I mean, this is obviously something which is really, really essential if we really need to hold this institution accountable, of course, for the process throughout the world. And above all, of course, what I personally don't like, you, Mark, have said that, of course, we cannot really trust the policymakers, which means the politicians, not the policymakers, but the politicians. The worst thing, actually, I honestly don't want to hear is actually we don't trust the politicians. They vote in the parliament, they vote everywhere across the world, but they actually convey the message we don't want really to support some reform processes like this, of course. So I wish really to encourage everyone, whoever is in the position, of course, to push for these changes, because these changes are very much needed, I would say. Thank you.
So I'm going to, oh, Sam, go ahead. No, we're on. Just turn the mic on.
Shall we get a microphone?
You mentioned you're from Serbia?
Yes.
Is that right? Okay. So
Kosovo and Serbia.
Kosovo. This one doesn't work. Because the government of Serbia has a really strong whistleblower law that they passed, and it's working really well. And what is the difference there is there was just a community from the government, civil society, outside experts, everyone coming together as a team. And there was a lot of public engagement, with the citizens to get buy-in before this law was eventually, passed and just celebrated and supported and implemented. And a lot went into implementing it. And I think that if you take an example like that, you can apply it here. There are coalitions of UN whistleblowers, and there's whistleblowers on the outside, and there's whistleblowers who are still on the inside, working in the system to see what they can do. And everyone in their small way, is helping. But if we don't all talk to each other and work together as a community, come together as a community, engage with the different stakeholders, then nothing is going to change, because there lacks political will and political pressure. There's a lot the media, journalists can do to elevate stories of whistleblowers and what's happening to get that groundswell of support. And TI, Government Accountability Project, and Whistleblowing International Network are working on, share with you, we're working on a proposal to work together to engage different stakeholders to really generate a strong campaign for reform at the UN and try to push this aggressively as possible, because it is time and it may take time, but I think if we work together that we can really make a difference, and so that is certainly the hope.
Yeah, just they closed it. Does it work? No, it doesn't work anymore. Okay. No, just to add.
Is this one working? No.
Listen,
Hello.
I'm just waiting. I'll try to come to outside. Okay? Hopefully this one.
Does this work? No, this one doesn't work either. Yes, it does. Okay. Just a point of clarification. I don't think it was me who said that I don't trust the policymakers or the politicians. I think that was Jim. But one thing I did want to say, and I agree fully that if we want these things to change, it involves connecting and uniting with civil society, with the people that are the United Nations. I mean, it is the member countries, it is the people of those countries that should have a vested interest in making sure this organization works and delivers on its promises to this world. One thing on reform, as I said before, the most significant part of this Secretary General's reform was really the delegation of authority, which is focused on delayering the organization, etc. And I think that has failed because with the delegation of authority, they did not put in place very robust compliance and oversight mechanisms to ensure that there's no wrongdoing. So I think that, and that was really the only significant part, in my opinion, of the reform, because the other reform was just shuffling offices around and give it different names, and that's it. So fix that, the delegation of authority, put in place strong compliance mechanisms and accountability measures, and if there is a way to come up with an independent mechanism that, I agree, reports directly to the GA, I think that's where we need to go. But there has to be political will, and I think we can foster that by working together with everyone and push from all sides, from inside and from outside. And that's what we are hoping to do.
Thank you so much. That's exactly the point. When you hear all this, you can get depressed, but the fact that you're hearing about all this means change is happening. So we do have solutions. We're not incapable of doing this, and thank you so much for coming. Thank you for the technical team for keeping the mics going, and thank you all for participating. You're part of the change, so thanks.